everyone. So nice to be back for another episode of Stories from Science. Over the last few weeks, we've seen so many variations when it comes to science. We've seen accidental discoveries and women in science and all kinds of stuff. So what have we not seen as yet? And have you wondered, I wonder if there are weird stories, but that might be true. And if you've at all had that thought, guess what? That's our episode today. Today, folks, we are going to look at weird but true stories in science. So a little bit on the lighter note, some of our stories have been very heavy. We've dealt with tragic heroes and tormented geniuses and things like that. So let's take a little turn, a little diversion to look at some of the weird things that may have happened in the world and the field of science. And we're going to do it the way we always do. So I'm going to make a statement, and you're wondering who is my guest. You are. So welcome once again, and I'd like you to play along with us as I make a statement which is related to the field of science, and you get to guess whether it's true or it's false. And then we will share a story with you and we'll determine whether that statement is true or false. So, are we ready? Let's go. Let's go with our first statement. Experiments were done to create hybrid human-ape super warriors. Yes, you heard me correct, and I like to repeat the statement so you can catch it. Experiments were done to create hybrid human-ape super warriors. Is that true or is it false? And of course, it's given you ideas of, if any of you have seen the movies, Planet of the Apes, what's going on here? Could there be anything to do with science at all? Now, let's think in general. When it comes to hybrid things, it has captured the imagination of humans forever. So there's a lot of Greek mythology and other mythologies that deal with hybrid. And then we are all quite familiar with the mermaid and the centaur, where, well, of course, the mermaid is a fish and a human, centaur is a horse and a human. And so are there hybrid things in real? Well, right away you're thinking, indeed there are. Humans have crossbreeded tigers and lions, and that gave us ligers. Bison and cows, that gives us beefaloes. Those are actual names, by the way. And camas and llamas, you can guess what that's called, right? Camas. So all of that is actually quite real, but the one we are really most familiar with is mule. So a mule is a mix of a crossbreeding between a horse and a donkey. And there is now this animal which has been so useful for transportation and agriculture and things like that. We are well familiar with the mule. So do you think it ever crossed anybody, and particularly a scientist in the biological fields, that could we make a human and ape hybrid to create a sort of super warrior class of people? Well, is that true or false? And I shall, if you've thought about it, the answer actually is that it's true, right? And what is the story behind it? So in 1910, right, in Russia at the time, in Soviet Union, there was a scientist called Ilya Ivanov, and he became very intrigued with the idea of making hybrid of apes and humans. And he believed that they would be super strong, that they would be immune to illnesses, and they'd get the best of both worlds. And he actually embarked on this project to try and artificially mix them and things like that, and create what you would call a humanzee. Right? So you could have guessed what that would be called. And he went actually all over the world to try and do these experiments. And what do you think happened? Do you think he was successful in his venture? Well, it turns out not. he actually was not successful at all in all his endeavors to try and crossbreed humans and apes. And as it happened by 1930, so after he had engaged in these, and he went all over the world trying to do these experiments, he was actually arrested in 1930. And you might be thinking, phew, it's a very scary area to venture into. And subsequent to that, after his arrest, he actually passed away and died 2 years later. So do humans continue to perhaps experiment with crossbreeding humans with monkeys and apes? Now, it turns out, like with chimpanzees, we share like 99% of our genetic material. And I don't know how you feel about this, but here in this show, we cover real science that's happening, and we bring the stories to you, right? And you make your judgment call on it. But as recent as 2019, a group of scientists from Spain and USA and China, they did actually make a human monkey embryo. I know these things send a chill down our spine, and but it was viable for 20 days only. And there's always a fail-safe mechanism that these experiments are never sent to the full period of gestation. So there is currently no such thing that we are aware of, and the statement that experiments were done to create hybrid human and ape super warriors is actually true. Experiments were done, but I will say, thankfully, they did not succeed. And the main gentleman, the Soviet scientist, was actually arrested. So there's a lot of issues when it comes to science about ethics and morality and what we are capable of doing. All right, so related on the same theme, I'm going to go to my next story. And here's my statement. Oliver, the human Z, had a marriage ceremony. So sometimes I actually have to explain my statement so you can get a sense of what are we talking about? What is she talking about? So Oliver is a chimpanzee that was very, very, very famous. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. And why are we saying Oliver the human Z? Because I get into my story, Oliver portrayed a lot of traits of humans. So this chimp, which came from Africa, was sold and was used as a performing chimp in many freak shows, was on television in the 70s. It was a really, really big thing. Millions of people came out to see Oliver. He went on world tours, right? And he walked upright on two legs. And we will share images of Oliver, the human Z, and that's what he was called. And his behavior and his traits, right, were very human-like. He could do chores. He would mix a drink. He would watch television and have a nightcap. He would smoke a cigar. And then, as the whole thing went along, Oliver started to get a little too close. He rather the company of women rather than chimps. And his whole facial features, which you would have seen in the images that we've shown, really confused people. So there was a big hoo-ha about what is going on here. Scientists wondered that maybe he's some sort of ape hybrid. So this is a real case we're talking about. Is it a cross between a gorilla and a pygmy chimp? So they did DNA tests on him, and there was also this rumor that was rampant at the time that the number of chromosomes that Oliver had was just one off from what humans have and one less than what chimps have. So was it a human Z? What was Oliver? Oliver was featured in Unsolved Mysteries on big channels in the US. And as I said, he was taken all over, and it was really, really a remarkable thing there. But up until 1990, in the 1990s, 1996 to be precise, scientists did do a DNA testing on him, and despite the rumors that the number of chromosomes he had did not match humans or wasn't between humans and chimps, it turns out that he had totally the number of chromosomes that chimps have. That scientifically he was a chimpanzee, but he got the fame of being a humanzee. So let's go back. You've probably forgotten what my statement was. Oliver the humanzee had a marriage ceremony. Now, you're wondering, because he moved like a human, he walked like a human, he had features of a human, he did chores, he mixed food to feed the dogs, right? The owners, they had a farm and things like that. And I did mention that he enjoyed the company of women and things like that. Well, is that statement, Oliver the humanzee had a marriage ceremony, true or false? This one is false. Right? So he didn't. So he was just carried all over. He had a lot of tests done on him, and eventually he was retired into a large nature park where he lived out the rest of his days until 2012. And that's not so long ago, is it? When he died at the age of 55 years old. So folks, between those two stories, what we're seeing is that we've had a fascination with crossbreeding, and also Oliver was touted as the missing link, that he was the missing link between apes and humans and things like that. But scientists never really, in general, supported it. It was really something I would like to say was very sensational. So you make your judgment call as to what do you think. Was Oliver something strange? There are people who still consider that we don't quite know what Oliver was. So Oliver certainly entertained us a lot, and he himself must have been quite a confused chap, and but he seemed pretty happy the time that he spent here on Earth with us. So I hope that you've enjoyed these two stories that we've begun with, and the episode today is on weird but true stories of science. And are you ready for another one? So let's go. All right, so here's my statement, and this is the statement. There are irrigation systems on Mars, right? So we've moved far away. We've actually gone off our planet and into the solar system. And what could this possibly be about? Is it true or is it false? So if you enjoy a little bit of astronomy and wonder what the statement could possibly have to do, I am actually going to leave you to think a bit about it as we will shortly go on our break. But let's just repeat what the statement is. There are irrigation systems on Mars. What do you think, folks? So at this point, we'll take a break and think about it, and when we come back, we'll see what the answer to that statement is, whether it's true or false that there are irrigation systems on Mars. I'll see you in a bit. Welcome back, folks. And during our break, I'm sure you've been perhaps doing a little bit of researching, a little Googling. What's really going on Mars? Are there irrigation systems on Mars? Because the statement we left you with before the break was there are irrigation systems on Mars. So the bigger question is, what does this have to do with stories that may be weird but true? So let's go back. Let's go back over 100 years to 1830. That's a long time ago. So the year is 1830. They've got telescopes by now, and there is an astronomer called Schiaparelli, an Italian dude, you can tell by the name, and he looks at Mars through his telescope. And at this time, the telescopes are not the big giant ones we see nowadays, but much, much smaller. And he draws the features, and he makes a beautiful artwork, which we will share with you, that you will be seeing. And he looks at it, and he calls them canales. and which from Italian translates to channels or canals, right? But someone else at that point takes it and runs. So another astronomer called Lowell looks at it and he absolutely is fascinated, and he says that this does not look like a natural feature, that surely if there are canals on Mars, then there would be waterways and there'll be systems, right? So see how it's going to our statement that the statement is reminding you there are irrigation systems on Mars. And Lowell believed there were irrigation systems on Mars. And this moved the story to that irrigation systems just don't happen, right? There must be living beings on Mars. And since they are on Mars, there are Martians. So have you ever wondered why, of all the different planets, why don't we hear about Venusians or Saturnians, can't even pronounce it, or people from Jupiter, but we always hear about Martians. And this has a lot to do with this story, right? Because it became a big hype. He even wrote 3 books. First one was called Mars. Second one, he called it Mars and its canals. So you can see his fascination with it. And Mars as the abode of life. So the whole story shifted from that there are these lines that Schiaparelli drew and saw and wondered if they were canals. Lowell takes it and runs and concludes that there must be Martian on Mars and these are irrigation systems. So we still haven't quite answered the question, is our statement true or false? Was Lowell correct in what he hypothesized? Well, by a couple years later, when you get invested very much in an idea, and sometimes it does happen to scientists, you will do anything to prove yourself right. So by 1907, Lowell takes a lot of his own personal money and he invests in photography systems and telescopes to get proper pictures of Mars to prove for once and for all that there were irrigation systems on Mars. And what do you think happened? When we say that he shot himself in the foot, because what did his pictures prove? His pictures actually proved the opposite. When we saw clearer images of Mars, these didn't look like irrigation systems or canals at all. And by then, most of the scientists and everybody were like, oh, that's a pooh-pah story. There's really not much into it. And then finally, everything was settled in the 1960s for sure, when we started sending missions out to Mars. So one of the earlier ones, Mariner, as it took images up close of Mars, all we saw was this dusty terrain of red sand and rocks and absolutely no evidence of water to be flowing in irrigation systems built by Martians. So Lowell is what we will say quite infamous, right, for spreading that rumor. So there are irrigation systems on Mars. That's totally false. There is no irrigation systems on Mars. So from the early pictures that they saw, he believed that, there are polar caps on Mars and that, it would melt down and people were, I shouldn't say people, the Martians were building agricultural systems and so on. But it was all wrong. And these stories are weird, but guess what? They are quite true. All right, so we've explored humanzees. We've made a journey to Mars, and let's see what we're going to do next. Okay, so our next weird but true story, which you're going to have to decide, has to do with this statement. And now we're moving to a particular gentleman, and at a particular time of the year, and I would say around October and November, there's always in the news, you hear a lot about Nobel Prizes being offered, right? So Nobel, we think this is Nobel. So that's a gentleman's name, and that's Alfred Nobel. And the prizes are what he sponsored, and they are in physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and for work in peace. And later on, they added one in economics, okay? But that was his original thing. So this statement, which I haven't said as yet, is connected with Alfred Nobel of the fame of the Nobel Prizes in science. And here it is. Alfred Nobel's obituary was published before his death. And it's like, oh, that's an odd statement. Well, what do you think, right? Obituaries are something that are published in the newspaper, especially of the people that are very big, famous, rich, right? Politicians and people like that. We see a pretty extensive obituary on them. So is this statement true, or is it false that Alfred Nobel's obituary was published before his death? Well, what is this connected with? So let's delve a little bit into the life of Alfred Nobel. So who is Alfred Nobel? He was born, he's a Swedish gentleman, and we could broadly say he's a chemist, he's an inventor, he's a scientist, a businessman who loved and wrote poetry and drama. But what is he most famous for? Apart from that, his name is immortalized in the annual awards that are given for what is said, for the greatest benefit to humankind, the Nobel Prizes. And I thought this would make an interesting story, because throughout this series, as we've looked at different stories from science, sooner or later I will say, oh, so-and-so received the Nobel Prize in physics, and they received it in chemistry because their work was of the greatest benefit to humankind. So what does that have to do with Alfred Nobel himself? And what is he known for? Well, in case you didn't know it, he invented the dynamite. That's what he's famous for. And he messed around with nitroglycerin and managed to come up with the right mixtures and compound where it's a very dangerous compound, and there would be explosions, and a lot of people got hurt in the labs trying to develop it. But eventually, Alfred Nobel was able to get a compound that was controllable, and we had dynamite. And that changed the face of engineering and building structures. The Panama Canal could not have been built without blasting through the rocks and the mountains, and the dynamite changed everything. And he was a brilliant man, and he had over like 355 patents. And with this, he became immensely rich, and became very rich and therefore very famous. But dynamites or explosives were not only being used for construction and for building, it became used in warfare as well. And in exercises which hurt people, as you can understand. This was never his intention, and he was devastated by all of this. All right, so let me read back the statement. The statement was, Alfred Nobel's obituary was published before his death. What does this have to do with everything? Well, it turned out that, so that's actually true. Right? So here's how the story goes, that his obituary was published before his death. How can that be? It turned out that actually his older brother Ludwig had died while he was on vacation. And in those days, they didn't have Google or artificial intelligence or ChatGPT to quickly check up information. And the journalist made an error, and he wrote an obituary assuming it was Alfred Nobel who had died. And he called him the Merchant of Death. Imagine opening up the papers and you are reading your obituary. Bad enough, you're reading your own obituary, but you're now being called the Merchant of Death. And if the article went on to say he became rich by finding a way to kill more people faster than ever before. It is thought that this had a tremendous effect on Alfred Nobel, and he began to think that this was not the legacy he wanted to leave behind. He did not want to be remembered as a destructive force while his time on planet Earth. And therefore, he decided he was going to change that reputation that he had developed, and decided to give his bulk of his immense wealth to rewarding efforts by scientists, because he was a chemist, for the greatest benefit of humankind. So that's why it's in areas that was close to his heart. It was physics, of course, chemistry, medicine. He had a deep interest in medicine. He generally was not always very well, and he wrote poetry and drama, and that's why there's a prize for literature and work for peace. So you can see why, because the dynamite was used as a weapon of war as well, and that's not what he wanted to be remembered for. So and even in all his experiences, his own another brother, Emil, had been killed by an explosion in the labs working with these dynamites. So there was all of this that had happened. And of course, when he had that in his will in 1895, where there's a will, there, right? You're thinking there's a way, right? But where there's a will, there are a lot of relatives. And a lot of relatives were very upset that he had given away all his immense wealth to given awards in science. And there was, as you can understand, litigation, and the whole thing dragged on for several years. So even though he died in 1895, when his will was read, it was not until 1901, several years later, that the first prize in the first prizes, Nobel Prizes, were offered. So weird but true that Alfred Nobel's obituary was published before his death. So, but look at what it did. Look at the impact of his obituary being published accidentally, wrongly, before his death, that today, now we have, and it's on the, in December every year that the awards are made. All right, so I think we have just enough time to do one more story that's weird but true. Okay, so what's our statement? Here it is. Mathematician turns down $1 million prize for solving a problem. Is that true or is it false? Let me read it back. A mathematician turns down $1 million prize for solving a problem. All right, so what's the backstory to this first to figure out if it's true or false? So there are problems in mathematics that people have not been able to solve for hundreds of years. So an institution was formed, the Clay Mathematics Institute, and that was just in 2000. And they offered a prize of $1 million for anybody who could solve 7 intractable problems in mathematics. Now these are, if the best geniuses in the world cannot solve them, who are we to even understand them? Well, this mathematician, Grigory Perelman, a Russian guy, he actually started to work on one of the problems and he solved it. And he didn't even publish it in a journal, as most scientists will do with their work. He just uploaded it on the internet. Right, so that's to just give you a sense of how long ago are we talking about, because some of my stories go back hundreds of years. No, this is very current. This is in the 2000s. All right, so it turns out that other scientists checked his work and it was quite correct indeed. All I'll tell you is that it was in the field of geometry, and Gregory Perelman had won the Clay Mathematics Institute prize of $1 million. So did he turn it down or did he accept it? So does the mathematician turn down $1 million prize for solving a problem? It's actually quite true. And why did he do that? I will end with some words from him. He said, everybody understood that if the proof is correct, then no other recognition is needed. And when journalists ask him, why did you refuse? He goes, I know how to control the universe, so tell me, why should I run for $1 million? And finally, he said, I don't want to be on display like an animal in a zoo. So he actually returned to Russia. I think he's currently in Sweden. He actually gave up professional mathematics, and he lives with his mom, was often supported by her pension. And how's that for a story that's weird but true? So folks, That brings us to the end of today's episode, where we looked at stories that are weird but true, and we've seen the most interesting things from humanities to the work of Alfred Nobel, and as well as a mathematician who turned down $1 million prize. Would you do that if you were able to solve the problem? All right, folks, so it's been wonderful having you on the journey with us today, and it's a wrap, and I shall see you next time.